Marriage is honorable and the bed undefiled. Let's talk about that today in the Word. Good morning and welcome back to Today in the Word. Hi, I'm Glenn Schaefer. I want to welcome all of you who are joining us on our podcast, and thank you for your faithfulness here on YouTube. Thank you for subscribing. If you haven't done so, be sure and do so. We're going to take one verse today on marriage in Hebrews chapter 13. Sometimes people are afraid to emphasize marriage because there's so many who are not married, but it's a biblical truth that should be addressed. And I think it's interesting, right here in the middle or the beginning of this chapter, after telling us, let brotherly love continue, be willing to entertain strangers with hospitality, and to identify with those who are in prison who are being mistreated, then he adds, marriage is honorable among all. Well, it should be added because that is a chapter of love. As we've said, it's faith, hope, and love, and chapter 13 is on love. So obviously, we should talk about it. Let's jump in here on verse 4 and read it. Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. Okay, why does he say marriage is honorable? Why would that be necessary? Well, obviously for two reasons. One, it could be the culture then is what it is today, where marriage is played down. Some would say marriage is not even important. It's two agreement. It's just a piece of paper between two people. We don't need that, yada, yada. Or it's just an agreement. No, marriage is not an agreement. Marriage is a vow of covenant before a holy God. God sees the marriage vow and covenant. When two people come together, there is a covenant union that is made. Now, the ultimate union, of course, our covenant is with Christ. But on the earth, the closest, most powerful covenant that two people can make is in the institution of marriage that God created. Man did not come up with the idea of marriage. There wasn't someone sitting around one day and said, you know what? I need a wife. I'm going to go get a wife. We're going to call it marriage. That's not how it happened. God created Adam out of the dust of the earth, woman out of Adam, and put them together and said, the two shall be one flesh. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined unto his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Paul quotes that right out of Genesis as God's original intent. That's what Jesus said himself when he said that was the original intent of God, that man would be married to a woman and no man would put it asunder. That's right. Marriage is honorable among all. Now, I believe that's both believers and unbelievers. Why? Because marriage is an institution of God. You could be an unbeliever, but if you agree in a covenant of marriage, then that marriage is honorable. Doesn't mean you're born again. It means that it is honorable to be in covenant with one another because God instituted the marriage. Even those who mock God or even claim there is no God, if they come into a union in marriage and covenant, guess what? They're in an institution that God created. So it is among all, honorable among all. Now, another reason it might be considered as questionable in their mind is it honorable because they would have been facing some present crisis that Paul the Apostle would have been under in his persecution when he wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And in that passage, he's talking to believers and he's saying that I would rather for you not to be married right now. If you want to be married and you're burning in your heart towards lust or sexual desire, it'd be better to go ahead and get married. So people read in that, wait a minute, marriage then is not honorable. No. What Paul was speaking to is made clear in verse 26 of 1 Corinthians 7 when he says, because of the present crisis, I think that it's good for man to remain as he is. Present crisis was during the same time that the book of Hebrews was written. There's great persecution. and the soon to come destruction of Jerusalem, the things that they were facing, and the persecution they were under Nero, Paul was saying because of that, presently it's better. Not saying that that was God's original intent. Now, there are those who are given the gift of singleness. Paul would have been one of those. Obviously, Jesus was our example of not being married, of course. And there are great men and women of God who have been given that gift and have never been married and have done quite well. But the ordinary order of things, according to the Scripture, is that God would have for us a companion, because the purpose of marriage is that companionship. And that's why I think the sexual union is so important, because when it's holy before God, there is no union like the union between a man and woman in marriage. There is just none. It's undefiled. Now, it can be defiled. When someone brings pornography, or they bring fantasy, or God forbid, even someone else into their marriage. So it's not saying that it can't be defiled. It's saying that marriage is honorable. And why is it defiled? Because, here's why it's defiled, because the sexual union between a male and a female, and a man and a wife in that marriage, is the closest intimacy of union that you're ever going to experience on this earth. It is holy. It's called holy matrimony, holy marriage, and it's honorable. And that's why a spouse can sense or feel the other spouse if their heart has left them in fantasy of emotion. Sometimes a wife can get attached somewhere else emotionally. The husband can get attached to pornography or through his own fantasy, and there's a disjointing, and that closeness is not there. See, one of the things that married couples ought to guard against is the intimacy. Make sure that the intimacy is not defiled, because that's referencing the marriage bed. That's honorable among all. But it is and can be defiled. No wonder the devil works to discourage sexual relationship in marriage and to encourage sexual relationship outside of marriage, because it's the most beautiful picture of God's proper divine ordained union between a man and a woman in marriage. It is one of the strongest drives and one of the greatest perversions, and you see it in every capacity. Abuse, trafficking, selling, fantasy. I mean, it's the greatest draw against the glory of God. That God created us in His image and gave opportunity for a man and woman to experience a union that's not like anything else. No wonder the devil would attack it so much and play it down and cause people to be led astray. So in this context, Paul even tells us over in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that a woman doesn't have authority over her own body in marriage, and a man doesn't have authority over his own body in marriage, that they really do belong to one another. Therefore, that's a protection against the defilement of it. And though it is undefiled in the holy union of marriage, he mentions fornicators and he mentions adulterers. He said they will be judged by God. It's interesting that these two words are used. Fornication would represent any kind of sex without the commitment of marriage. It also can be used to refer to any kind of sexual sin. Jesus used it when he said that if anyone who is married and the sin of fornication is committed against that marriage, then they have permission for divorce. And you thought he would have used the word adultery, but the word fornication there, porneia, means all sexual uncleanness. So it's not just someone having a sexual intercourse with someone else that defiles a marriage, but sexual sin of all kinds can defile the covenant of the marriage. Doesn't mean it has to break the covenant, but it does defile it, given permission for that covenant to be severed. That's how serious God sees sexual unfaithfulness. So fornication would be sex outside the commitment of the covenant, where adultery would refer to not being faithful to the marriage vow. And God referred to Israel as being adulterers because their heart turned from him. And that's why Jesus could teach that if you look upon a woman to lust after her in order to have sex with her, then you've committed adultery already in your own heart, because adultery really has to do with the heart. That's why in a marriage, the intimacy of marriage, it is recognized by the spouse when that is out of order. And it would make sense right here in the middle of this chapter on love that the writer of Hebrews would say marriage, because that's where the love of Christ is exemplified the most. For the husband to lay his life down for his wife, and the wife to respect her husband as unto the Lord. Both are as unto the Lord. Therefore, it is a fulfillment of love. It makes sense why he would say, let brotherly love continue. Have hospitality toward strangers. Remember those who are persecuted in prison, and guard your marriage. Don't you love the scripture? Thank you for joining us today in the Word.